including me today and for your leadership here at Rotary. I also want to make sure that we have a special welcome to those that have come from so far to be here today. I'm sure you came just to hear me speak, and I'm confident that's and I thought what I'd do is give you a little update on what's been happening in Washington, some of the accomplishments that we've had in the last 18 months. I am a freshman in Washington, so I've not been there long, and didn't really come from elected office. I'm actually a small business owner. We're actually, yes, I went to Washington Business School, but at least for the people that I work with in my small business, it's about 100 people. It's 100 families as far as I'm concerned. The real respect that I get from them is actually crawling under houses and going into crawl spaces and actually doing the job from their perspective. And so I will say that it is important. I think that we have more people in Washington, D.C. that have met a budget, met a payroll, understand what it's like to actually create a job, hire someone, and also understand in that instances where you've got to let someone go. And frankly, we don't have nearly enough of that, I think, in Washington, D.C. In terms of what's been happening in Washington, I think we've had an opportunity to kind of change the dynamic and change the discussion in Washington from how much more are we going to spend to how much more can we cut, and how can we do so in a responsible manner. And if we take a look at some of the things that we've been able to accomplish, I think that certainly, are you frustrated in Washington?
Yes.
I certainly hear from people all the time that they're frustrated. Let me tell you, I'm extremely frustrated as well. And as a small business owner, I can tell you that there's no question that I think people are wanting us to be able to come together, to work together, to be able to try to get things accomplished. The President of the United States actually came before a joint session of Congress and talked about the need for us to be able to work together. And when the President's right, and the President wants to do something, I work with the President. So the President came and said, you know what, this is my jobs plan, you need to pass it and pass it right now. Frankly, there weren't enough votes in the United States Senate to pass the President's jobs plan. Democratically controlled Senate. But as opposed to dismissing it out of hand, what I chose to do is say, what are the areas of agreement? Where do we agree with the President? The President talked about eliminating regulation and red tape for small businesses. Frankly, I agree. We need to be eliminating the red tape. 2/3 of all net new jobs are created by small business. So from my perspective, I wanted to say, okay, where can we come together? The President talked about trying to double exports by 2014. And so that's an area certainly I agree. We want to double exports by 2014. Why is that so important? Certainly for the 10th District. 10th District is actually the second largest manufacturing district in the country. Most people don't realize that. We've got 620 manufacturers representing over 93,000 employees. And so the idea that we want to be able to sell American all over the globe is something that I think is really positive. Because 95% of our consumers are outside of the United States. 73% of the purchasing power is outside of the United States. What we'd like to do is level the playing field for the American worker so that the American worker can sell their goods and services all over the globe. And so from my perspective, the idea that we were able to pass trade agreements with South Korea, Panama, Colombia are positive. $10 billion will go to the bottom line in our GDP with South Korea alone. I think that's a very positive step. According to the administration's own estimates, 250,000 new jobs will be added. If you take the Chamber of Commerce, it's probably 350,000 new jobs. So certainly those are areas of agreement. So when the President comes up, as opposed to dismissing those things out of hand, my tact has been, where is it that we agree, and let's focus on that. Right? Would you agree? With the camera, you'd agree? I hope so. The idea is that I think the American public wants us to be able to come together and focus on areas of agreement. And so I'm pleased to say that of all the members in the United States Congress, whether it be Congressional Quarterly, GovTrax, National Journal, Washington Post, all of them have ranked me as one of the most independent members in the United States Congress. Some people might not think that's a good thing. I think that's a great thing. Because frankly, when I talk to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and say, what do you think is the biggest issue we face? They say it's jobs and the economy as well. So the areas of agreement, I think, are there. And frankly, the way that we need to move forward is to focus on those areas of agreement. And when the party is wrong, I'm one to stand up and say the party's wrong. We had a transportation bill that they wanted to pass. And frankly, they were trying to cut mass transit. Well, for us here in our region, we recognize mass transit plays a vital role. Not only the wear and tear on the streets and the roadways and those types of things, are the ability in terms of trying to make it greener, to be able to use mass transit is absolutely vital, how we move people around. And so I stood up to the party and actually worked with Dan Lipinski and Judy Bigger to make sure that mass transit funding got put back in to the transportation bill, because I think it's going to be absolutely critical for us as we move forward. I have been working on the Financial Services Committee. It is one of the powerful committees in Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to say that we have passed a number of bills out of the Financial Services Committee, things like access to capital for job creation. We've passed a series of bills that passed the House with over 400 votes. Now, why is this important to talk about? Because you hear a lot about the partisanship. You hear a lot about, one party and things passing on just party line votes. Did you all hear about the bills that passed the House with 400 some odd votes? Went over to the United States Senate and sat. And yet we've got an unemployment rate that frankly is at 8.3% today. Frankly, it's higher than that nationally. I'm sorry, that's national. It's higher than that here locally. In areas of the 10th district, we've got an unemployment rate of 20 and 22%. So I think that what we need to be doing, certainly as we look forward, Washington has to create an environment that enables the private sector and small businesses all across the country to be able to have the confidence and the certainty to invest in their business and grow. There are 29 million small businesses in our country. If we can create an environment where half of them can create a single job, think about where we'd be then. That ought to be what we're focusing on. Recently, I'm happy to say that we had to repackage a number of those jobs bills, and that was something that the President signed into law. I also was pleased that I was one of several congressmen that helped push forward sanctions to try to make sure that we're having more transparency with regard to members of Congress, and push forward no pensions for felons. Unfortunately, in Illinois, we know that all too well. Part of the reason for doing that was the fact that Governor Rod Blagojevich was receiving a congressional pension, taxpayer-funded pension, and I think that was the wrong thing to do. That was something else that the President and I certainly agreed on, and that was signed into law. Recently, the President signed into law around sanctions bills. Again, ratcheting up sanctions on Iran, which I believe is the greatest threat we have today to our own national security here in the United States. And so I was pleased to work with Ted Deutsch, a Democrat from Florida, on bills in terms of trying to focus in on the energy sector in Iran and trying to make sure that we're ratcheting up sanctions on the energy community that does business with Iran. Because that's something that I think is absolutely important. That passed the House, passed the Senate, and the President just signed that into law last Friday. But as you see, the work that's been done in Congress, I don't think is nearly enough as we look at where we are from an unemployment perspective. And so from my perspective, as we see the unemployment rate continue to rise, that to me is an issue. Because as we see the amount of resources that we're right now, we've got about 16% in terms of the revenues that are coming in to GDP. Normally it's higher than that. With regard to expenditures, we're at 24%. And really it should be closer to about 20%. So the idea is that we need to have more people that are getting back to work, get more people off the unemployment lines, and start working today. We've got 12.8 million Americans that are unemployed. You and I both know that that number is deflated because there are those that have left the unemployment lines that aren't even looking. We have those that are just graduating. We have 50% of recent college graduates that are unemployed or underemployed. So we've got a significant issue that we need to address. The President talked in 2010 about there's no way in the world that we should be raising taxes at this point in time on such a fragile economy. I agree. I think the economy is fragile right now. And raising taxes is something that I don't think that we ought to be doing, certainly for 12 months. And at the time the President made that comment, the economy was growing at 3.5%. Commerce Department just came out last month and said the economy is growing at 1.5%. It's actually worse now than it was before. So I do think that we've got to talk about comprehensive tax reform. whether that be, you've heard the President talk about comprehensive tax reform, you've heard the Simpson-Bowles Commission talk about the need for comprehensive tax reform. Certainly in the House, we've talked about the need for comprehensive tax reform to make sure that we can be more globally competitive, to try to make sure that we can eliminate a number of the lobbyist loopholes and drop the rate so that we can be more competitive in the global marketplace. So I think that's certainly something that we need to be focusing in on. We've got a debt and deficit. Right now, the year before, this last year, we're talking about a deficit of $1.5 trillion. What's $1.5 trillion mean to you?
It's a lot of money.
So, I hear that a lot, it's just a lot of money. And so frankly, when we look at that, when you try to put your arms around it, works out to be about $3.4 million a minute in deficit spending. Well, frankly, what we're doing is we're jeopardizing future generations and their ability to realize the American dream, because we're burying them under a mountain of debt. Frankly, what this does, I think, is it really jeopardizes the American compact. The idea that we are going to leave our country better for the next generation than we received from our parents and grandparents. Isn't that indeed the unwritten compact that we have with ourselves? Well, I fear that I may be the first generation of Americans that doesn't live up to that compact. And for me, that's completely unacceptable, which is why I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to work across the aisle with anybody that's got serious proposals to try to make sure that we're solving the issues that are in front of us. During the budget season, for the first time in a generation, there was a bipartisan budget that came to the floor of the United States House of Representatives, based upon the Simpson-Bowles framework. There were 8 co-sponsors, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. Chicago had 2. I was the Republican from the region, Dan Lipinski was a Democrat. Unfortunately, there were only 38 votes in the House of Representatives that decided to vote for a bipartisan budget. Was it everything that we were going to want it to be? Of course not. But it is something that says we need to address the big issues in front of us. And so I do think that as we look and stare at the most predictable crisis that's coming down the pipe, and that's the fiscal cliff, it's going to take Republicans and Democrats working together to solve this issue. Can't do it with one party alone. You've heard about the jobs deficit. You've heard about the budget deficit. You probably haven't heard a lot about the leadership deficit that's in Washington, D.C. There's a tremendous leadership deficit, and frankly, this is the time where real leadership's needed. And frankly, I think that it's going to be about trying to focus on what I'm going to call my own jobs agenda. And certainly for those that have had an opportunity to go through the jobs agenda, I think it's important that we focus on some of these big issues. And so as we look ahead at the Main Street jobs agenda, I'll say pro-growth tax reform. We talked a little bit about the need for pro-growth tax reform, which is going to have to be trying to simplify the tax code and working with those across the aisle, as we've seen from not only the President, but Simpson-Bowles. Increasing exports and manufacturing, we talked about that just a little bit, and the need, how this is important for us in terms of how we make things and do things here in our country. Infrastructure in terms of if we're going to spend our resources, how we move goods and services around is absolutely vital to our economy. Would anybody disagree? How we move our goods and services around is absolutely critical. Not only our roads, our bridges, our airports, our ports, and for us in the Great Lakes system, it's going to be our harbors. And those things, I think, are going to be absolutely important in terms of how we invest in that infrastructure for the long
Because you
haul.
don't have this gentleman's permission.